She was thinking simply and clearly. She was thinking small and clear music that was stretching a single thread and unfurling bright, fluorescent and moist, water and water, meditating a silly arpeggio. She was thinking untranslatable sensations, distracting herself secretly as if humming. Profoundly unaware and stubborn, she was thinking a swift streak. In order to be born, things must have life, for birth is a movement. If they said that movement is necessary only for the thing giving birth, and not for the thing that is born, that's not right, because the thing that gives birth cannot give birth to something outside its nature, and thus always gives birth to a thing of its own kind. And so it is with movements too. In this way, stones were born that have no power of their own, but were once alive, otherwise they wouldn't have been born, and now they're dead because they don't have movement in order to give birth to another stone. No thought was extraordinary. Words are what would be. She was thinking without intelligence about her own reality, as if discerning and could never use what she was feeling. Her meditation was a way of living. It was coming to her without a shape of its own, yet at the same time within its chiming some precise and delicate quality, like thin numbers entangled with thin numbers, and suddenly a new light number ringing polished and dry, while the true sensation of her whole body was expectant. Hey, this is David.
Hey, this is Nathan.
And this is Nick. You're listening to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. Today we're talking about Brazilian author Clarice Lispector and her 1946 novel, The Chandelier. Just a heads up, this is going to get real metaphysical. This novel explores really what the meaning of existence is, what the nucleus of a single instant can be, and how that maps to increasingly beautiful and poetic language. And it's a bit of a struggle to get through at times, but it's truly rewarding. So if you haven't read the book, grab a copy and enjoy this episode.
Well, I'm curious. I have a question. So this novel is, I guess, kind of an obscure novel from a relatively unfamiliar author for English audiences. How did this book get chosen?
Lispector is kind of having a resurgence or like a reintroduction moment in a way, right? So New Directions is putting out a bunch of her books in English translation, but there's also just there's a little bit of a buzz actually. So I think we landed on this, at least myself, just kind of picking up on that. I've seen so many people talking about Clarice Lispector and just remarking on like how unique it is in the language and all that stuff. And they're people that I kind of respect from like a literary opinion standpoint. And so this one's been on my list for a while, and I think that kind of led us to this point.
Why the Chandelier though?
Do you guys have the one with the pink cover?
Yeah.
It's pretty badass. Good question. Just it's one of the more recent ones, I guess. Also, it seemed a little bit meatier, right? Which is something we can also try to discuss, because that's one of my thoughts of this book is it's really not that different from some of her slimmer books, and I feel like the slimmer books really get to some of the same points in a slimmer fashion.
So when you say meatier, this is just one of her longer works?
Yeah, I mean, most of her works are, 100 pages or, a little over than that. They're incredibly dense, but pretty short on the page count. And then she has a huge book of short stories that, honestly, I feel like that lines up a little bit more with kind of what I feel her vibe is, which is that deep inspection into something. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that long, I think. But yeah, so we just landed on this based on, hey, this is one of the longer ones. This will be perfect. But yeah, I mean, so I guess on that topic of language and stuff, I mean, that's what I really want to hear your guys' thoughts on is this, to me, at least in the English translation that we're reading, doesn't really have an obvious thing to point to in terms of tone and sentence structure and style of I don't know, thinking and analysis and things like that. So where do you place this within, I don't know, things that you've read?
For me, it struck me as there's like almost it's almost delirious. This sort of, her language kind of flows like a trance. My cat's meowing at the door already. I don't know if you can hear her.
Keep it.
And that sort of delirium reminded me of Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. There's a poetry and like a kind of having to, it's a density of language that you just kind of have to roll with. And then there's also this almost striving for a sublime understanding that I think they share also.
Yeah, I could see that. And I would say the early portions of this novel reminded me a little bit of kind of Joycean.
Mm-hmm.
Parts of Portrait of the Artist, a little Ulysses in sections. But yeah, it's very modern in terms of literary style. It's very much a modern novel because it has that, like you kind of talked about it, this sort of claustrophobic interiority, right? It's just so much is happening inside of this one person that it's excessive, just layers upon layers of adverbs and adjectives and all these really... Okay, so my day job is I teach English as a language, and so it was kind of frustrating to read this in the beginning. And at first I thought maybe, because I bought a Kindle edition, I was like, did I buy some sort of cheap-ass translation? Like, what the fuck is happening right now? The syntax is all off. There's jarring collocations, like words that don't associate together or put together. The verb tense switches constantly, often in mid-sentence. So it's like, all right, I bought a bad book. This is not correct. And then I just kept reading and reading until it kind of sucked me in because I realized that that's what this book style was. Like, it had to train me how to read it because I hated it in the beginning. And now I kind of like it, actually. It really grew on me. And it took, I don't know, not that long, but I'd say a good 30, 40 pages before I began to like it and stop thinking of it as a really bad spoken word poem put into a novel form.
Yeah, the Joycean aspect, I think, is pretty real. And a little nugget of a story about Lispector is that her first book, Near to the Wild Heart, is named after a Joyce line, but she hadn't actually read any Joyce at that point. But I think at some point somebody suggested it to her or came across it somehow, and then it basically connected her to Joyce. So those comparisons kind of were always there. I think she was frustrated by that. She's like, there's nothing Joycean about it. I didn't read Joyce. I don't know what that is, right? But yeah, I agree with that. I also, in the explorations of just metaphysics and really the definition of what anything is, what existence is, what blank is, I mean, that to me reminds me of Beckett's trilogy, just that discussion and analysis of what reality is. But I'll also note that I suggested this in our local reading group, and I was kind of like a bit filleted about it. People are like, no, it's not Beckett at all. And so I agree from like a sentence structure, it's got a unique tone. But I mean, she spends pages upon pages about just really like looking at what a fraction of time is, essentially. You know, there's just all of these different ways of her asking that same question. And I guess to frame it, I'll read one that I think often stands out because it's got this quote that is used all over the place. It says, behind secure movements, she was trying with danger and delicateness to touch the same light and elusive, to find the nucleus made of a single instant before the quality came to rest on things, before what really came unbalanced in tomorrow. And so that comment, the nucleus of a single instant, to me, that's essentially the plot of this book, right? Is a young woman walks around and sort of ponders essentially what time is, what her reality is, what her senses, bring to her, and what that really means. And so it's just this absolute just dive into minutia. And to me, that vibes a lot with what Beckett did once he got into, Malloy and Malone Dies and The Unnamed and stuff like that. So that's what I find in terms of cues.
Yeah, I can't go there with you, but I haven't read those books. My foray into Beckett is much more sterile land, and this is, shimmering with psychedelic revelations, which is about as far from Beckett as I could imagine. Beckett's like reading a math textbook. Even if they're approaching the same, nugget of what is real, what is really real. I think she approaches it like, let's just turn the faucet all the way on and then, try to catch a few drops of water. And Beckett is like, let's turn the faucet all the way off and count the drops that come out. But something that I really enjoyed about the book is that it's, there's this interiority that David is talking about, but there's also a very strong author's voice that she often talks about how the character doesn't know that she's thinking this, or that she would never be able to find words for this. She's not experiencing this as words. So the author is giving us this sort of supernatural understanding of what it's like to be a child, which I thought David didn't like the first 30 or 40 pages. I loved the first 30 or 40 pages. I thought her ability to capture the magic of childhood and those like weird relationships with space and siblings. I've never read anything that kind of put me back into childhood the way the first 40 pages did. But even her ability to put into words these ephemeral moments, what's happening in the moment that you forget, the moment before you approach your lover in the park, the moment right after, the father slaps the daughter in the face, and to create this, to me, this incredible clarity of emotion was incredible.
I got to push back on that. I don't think it's clarity. I find it incredibly muddled. I don't find the clarity, not to say that, sorry, and to defend myself, I actually like the beginning of the book quite a lot. It just, when I first started reading it, I hated it because I was fighting against the weird poetry of it, and then it kind of won me over. But as much as I do like that part, and I think I prefer the opening to much of the middle, like there's moments of really, really interesting like little insights. Like you mentioned when she got slapped, and then she takes this like moment and notices like a shoelace on a shoe. But I guess clarity is not the word that comes to mind when I think of, I just find it so full of descriptors that don't really attach to anything in particular, that it's like she's trying to describe all sensations at one time. And it's not like a sense of clarity, it's more like a feeling and just like a sense of things. Just this synesthetic attack of yeah.
But
I guess synesthetic attack.
That's what I mean though. Like there's a clarity of emotion that what she hits at to me is something that transcends language, and that's why like there's no like I don't even have to forgive the crazy syntax and adverbs and adjectives, because to me her language kind of like launches me up into this emotional realm that is hard to find in life, let alone in reading, because words are simply, symbols. They're representative of something. And I found her ability to like suddenly put you in this emotional, so you understand this emotional state. And part of it, I think, is creating this fog, creating this trance, kind of hypnotizing you into a place where you can feel that again.
So it's like Terrence Malick's Tree of Life.
Actually, yes. It's very impressionistic. Yeah, exactly.
I actually put down money in a betting pool separately from this, waiting to see how long it would take us to make a Tree of Life reference.
Okay.
It happens like every 17th Boss episode, somebody makes a Tree of Life reference.
Is that right? Do we make that many references to
Yeah, it's in there. That and Borges. Those are our cultural touchdowns.
Hot damn. Well, they are two of the greatest things of all time. So what are you going to do?
You like what you like. But there's speaking of liking what you like, there's a Krasznahorkai quote that I always loved. I think it comes from War and War. It's just reality examined to the point of madness. And I was thinking about that a lot while reading this, because like you say, there's so much detail that somehow it almost doesn't line up, right? It's so specific that it becomes vague. It's just like overload. And there's a small quote that I flagged that to me, she almost kind of queued that up, which is, what would make her despair distantly was in most cases the uselessness of her lucidity. And to me, that uselessness of lucidity is this book. It's got so much in terms of, the sensory input that you can't make a pattern out of it. You think of a standard narrative, and the author is introducing things that are relevant to the story, to the trajectory, to anything. But this has no limit. Like Nathan said, it's basically like the fire hose. And so it is just insanely examining a single moment in reality. And even though the tone of it is very different than Krasnohorkai, I think it's getting at a similar aspect, which is just the absolute specific honing in on something. And that can be a cool thing, but weirdly, it didn't completely resonate with me the way that a lot of those other authors do. I think that's something I'm still struggling with. Like you guys mentioned, like hating or loving, like the first part of the book. I think I kind of was just middle of the road the whole time.
I have a hard time imagining that. This book, I feel like it, because similar to Nathan, I had an experience where I was like there were moments where I felt like I was on psilocybin or something. Like it was just real trippy. Yeah, it kept kind of going inward and examining things to the point of madness, where you're just staring at a wall or at a corner or at something shimmering. You're like, okay, this is what it feels like to really understand and experience time passing. And it is interesting what Nathan mentioned, that the author often will observe that Virginia she's sitting there thinking these things without thought. She's trying to understand these things without words. But the only way that the author could describe them is through words. And so and I don't know what her style is, because this is the only book I've read. So I don't know if this is throughout all of her novels, but this barrage of disjointed detail and sensation in order to try to get at what it's like to just be in a moment without trying to analyze it necessarily.
Can I read that exact quote that's talking about what you just mentioned?
No, you can't.
No,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I mean, classic thing, right? I'm already on the 7th quote I'm reading. So like whatever I just said about kind of liking it is obviously a lie.
Yeah.
So she says, "You could wear yourself out just being. Every minute that had passed, she had been. She couldn't tolerate talking about herself. She gathered herself up, insoluble, anguished. In short, the essential thing would escape words spoken, and that was in the end the feeling of having lived whatever she'd recounted. The delicate, incessant indecision of a life seemed to be in its relationship with whoever was living it, in the intimate awareness of its contact." So yeah, being is anguish. It's just, just think about that. That's a great freshman literature moment. But it's so disorienting. And this is, I read 2 of her other books and most of her shorts, and I do find commonality in this approach with her other books. And I think the thing that was burning me out a little bit is after a while, when you get 2/3 of the way through this book and she's really still questioning, the burden of existence, it doesn't feel that new anymore to me, But I have a million quotes. Like it's unbelievably poetic and beautiful.
I can't even find one to read. It's too many. I keep trying to find something.
And I think that's the point, and that's what I always come back to with these arguments is to me, if I'm marking a bunch of moments that made me feel something, that's the definition of a good book. I'm less concerned with character development. I'm less concerned with plot. And so to me, that checks the box. It was truly challenging, I think.
But I found, in addition to it being, poetic and immensely quotable, that the characters are actually very compelling. And there is a character development, and there is actually, I don't know if you would say that there's plot exactly, but there is a narrative arc. I don't find it to be simply wordplay.
Can we task you with summarizing the plot / narrative arc?
Yeah. I think it's pretty simple. It begins in this girl's childhood, and largely in her relationship to her brother, her older brother, and who she looks up to a lot and kind of takes a lot of her cues from him. And he's a much more dominating personality. And her relationship to the farm where she grew up, which was her entire reality. Then she, like a third of the way through the book, she's in the city and she's now a young woman, and her experiences, a couple of things happen, but mostly her experience at this dinner party and with a couple of men, the doorman, I think, at her boarding house, who she became friends with, and then her lover, and her kind of coming to understand herself within these relationships. And then her return to the farm after her grandmother dies, and re-examining her experiences in the city and trying to interpret them for her family, and trying to decide whether to return to the city or stay on the farm. So that's basically what happens. But I think, to me, there's a significance to these events, that these aren't just, it's not just a plot, but these are major points in everybody's life at a archetypal level. You know, I mean, I guess it's a coming of age story, right? That's what it is in the most summary. Who am I now? What is my relationship to my childhood, and where am I going?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing I really do appreciate about Lispector is she gives such a serious voice to girls and young women. And I think the level of seriousness that she gives to, say 8-year-old characters or 12-year-old characters is something that, oftentimes we see in literature with young boys. I mean, the young boy coming of age story is pretty common, but in a lot of her other works, this is true too. But Nathan, like you said, it's a real world to these children. I mean, these things are incredibly serious. The games that they set up and the tensions and the emotions that they feel are intense, and they are real. And so in terms of, that arc that you laid out, I think that's something that very much resonates with me, is getting to connect with that too, and remembering how real that stuff was when you were a kid, but also, getting that window, getting that view into a young girl's world is, to me, something that hasn't come through in terms of common voices in literature. And so just getting that mid-century kind of look into that through Lispector's analysis and voice, I think that was a really important aspect of this. And it's a really important aspect of, what she's contributed with the rest of her books too. So I get that, but, laying out what you laid out, I kind of go back to my early comment. There's nothing in here that couldn't fit in a much slimmer book, right? It's basically kind of in 3 sections, like you said. And I think that's the thing I'm grappling with when I describe how I'm like a little bit in the middle, is that I don't think this thing would have suffered if it was a bit more compact.
I think it would have improved quite a bit, honestly. Because as much as I highlighted things and liked things, there were also moments where I read many, many pages in a row and thought and felt nothing. I was just kind of lost in the fog of the metaphysics of it all, which was interesting, but I think I could have had a stronger and better experience if it was shorter, or maybe I shouldn't have tried to finish the book in a matter of 2 days. But maybe that's my fault.
Which is absolutely incredible to me. I mean, this one, I don't think I read more than 30 or 40 pages a day. It was work. This was manual labor.
Yeah, I just kind of fell into it, man. And maybe it is the Tree of Life thing, and maybe it is that I struggled so much with the opening, but I really, really liked the opening of this book so much now, probably because I would get lost in the middle when she was kind of on her own, and there were parts that I just, the character development and the dialogue sections were a little less interesting than the actual language play and philosophical sort of investigation of Virginia's self. But I think you guys kind of nailed it, that she really captures a sort of seriousness that I forgot existed in youth, like the idea of the Society of Shadows is like a very serious and integral part of your life as a kid. Mm-hmm. Did you guys belong to any secret societies when you were little? Did you have any passcodes to get into forts and that kind of shit?
I remember spending some time with, I don't know, like maybe one of my like math textbooks or something, but like myself and a friend deciding that we were going to like find the codes in it. And we would like go out back into like I guess a shed / playhouse, and we would just crack codes all day long. And so that was important.
Nice.
But yeah, you're right. Like that was a thing that was the most real. Like that was incredibly important. There was like nothing else in the world at that moment, being like an 11-year-old, that anyone could have told us that was more important than getting these codes out of this math book or something. I think that's a real thing. I mean, and you're right. It like bringing that seriousness back to the forefront. I think that's really one of the big things that this book does. But also, I mean, you know, from a historical standpoint, it's showing the oppression, all the cards that are stacked against young women, right? You're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so seeing Virginia going between her home as a young girl and then moving to the city, and then being caught between a couple of these moments as she's trying to unpack things in this fire hose of lucidity. I do think there's a lot of social commentary there, and a lot of, like I said, a window into what it means to be a young girl that Lispector, you know, really did contribute across a lot of different books. And so I think the combination of that, you know, like anything, the more we talk about it, I'm like, oh, this is a pretty good book.
To me, the most, I mean, there's a lot of things I like about this book, if that's not obvious. But the character relationships, her relationship with her brother, what's his name?
Daniel.
Blanked on his name all of a sudden. Yeah, Daniel. Her relationship with Daniel, which, you know, I think would be easy to read that as almost incestuous, her kind of obsession with him. But kind of the earnestness that she writes about that, like there's not, I think it cheapens it to say that there's anything incestuous about it, because relationships between siblings are weird, especially if you spend all of your time with your siblings. And, you know, that's such a defining, you know, that person becomes sort of an archetype in your life. And the describing it both in the beginning of the book as children, and then he doesn't appear again until the end of the book when she returns to the farm, and how broken his life is and how she can't reach him anymore, I thought was beautiful as well.
Yeah, and that's where you kind of see another sort of sense of character development. And, well, one, who Daniel is, which is kind of in the beginning as this young child, this sort of, although he's much older, is my understanding, right, than her, at least.
I
a couple years.
Older.
Yeah, I figured he was just a few years older. You know, when you're a kid and someone who's 2 years older is like, knows everything.
Yeah. But he has this sort of very commanding presence and this sort of almost authoritarian grip over her. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then to see him later as this sort of broken figure, and how she sort of hero worshipped him almost as a child and obeyed him in every way, but still sort of fought for her freedom. And I think kind of Nick got at that in terms of social commentary. There's a lot of this sense for her fighting for her own place and her own sense of self throughout the book, both not only inward but outward, you know, when she escapes from her cousins before she goes to the boarding house and everything. And then even at the party, she gets this sense. There's a line, man, I wish I could, where she's talking to someone else at the party, and she makes like she says something like, it's funny how when you get all these people together, they all start thinking in the same way, or speaking in the same way, or something like that.
I thought I highlighted that, but I couldn't find that one either. I was looking for that the other day.
And I've kind of trailed off from talking about Daniel, because I kind of got stuck now on this sort of fight for her own self. But
your thought process is very Clarice Lispector-esque.
Yeah. I think that's what happens when you're with this book.
Exactly. It starts to mess with how things fire in your old noggin.
It's a drug.
But yeah, I mean, I had highlighted on that social commentary aspect. I'd highlighted a thing at her description of the party where it says, in a few short minutes, she would enter the living room by destiny, and everyone would not see her while smiling at her for a second. How to free oneself. Not to free oneself from something, but just free oneself, because she wouldn't be able to say from what. And it's just, again, there's just so many these moments that really do stick out. But I actually kind of liked when the novel would kind of transition back from these like intense metaphysical explorations into some of the dialogue and into some of the more traditional moments, because there was just like an emptiness in some of those. Like a lot of the dialogue in this book is truly, I don't know, it's almost nothing. It's very banal. It's almost, I don't even want to say bad. It's more
boring.
so accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah, like we don't say useful things in real life. Like we just don't.
Yeah.
And so she's got lots of just sort of like ellipses and like ums and like, oh, it doesn't really matter what I say because you know what I was going to say. So I like that a lot.
I want to read a quote when she goes back to the farm and she's at the dinner table and they're asking her, especially her sister Esmeralda is asking her about the city, and the conversation, she keeps thinking like she's trying to ask me something, but she's not going to ask it. And so the conversation just kind of like falters along. And then after the conversation, she, Lispector kind of gives you she's like, this is what she would like to have said. Let me try to find that. Give me a second. I can't find any quotes. I've got too many highlighted. I even like bookmarked them. And I'm like, also, it's really hard to read a quote while we're talking because it's in a different language. I can't focus on both those things at the same time. Anyway, give me a second. Oh, I found it. I found it.
Oh, you found it. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just read the whole paragraph. She was asking again and asking like someone fumbling around distressed without ever finding the question she really wants to ask. Virginia was understanding her without words while they were looking at each other sincerely deep and speaking of various things. She knew that Esmeralda would like to hear that one day she was sitting on a bus distracted and tired. Suddenly the unmoving faces atop the bodies, the heat of the wheels, the dust shining dry as it met with the sun. All of a sudden, a movement of her own arm grazing the seat or her breast awoke in her the understanding of the lust that was vibrating in soft, uninterrupted sounds in the air and connecting creatures with fragile and quavering threads. You can't say that. There's so much more there that somebody wants to ask and you want to say, but you never can. Because the important thing, the real substance of what you're trying to say is always between the words. And that's what this book is, right? All the things people actually say to each other are banal and they can't quite understand each other. And then, between two brief lines at the dinner table, you read 10 pages in Lispector's writing. And that's the substance of what's actually happening, in my opinion.
Speaking of substance, do we want to talk about that substantial thing that happened at the end of the book?
Smooth transition.
Which I feel like this is a cliche, but, spoiler alert, because it's hard to talk about this book without talking about the end. But the ending comes out of nowhere, and it's really better to read it and have it hit you fresh. So I would say that if you are on the edge of reading this book, you should not listen to this part, because the ending is cool as you're reading it in real time. But so just at the end, when she gets run over by a car and dies suddenly, and there's these, 2 to 3 pages of kind of funny discussion and commentary about it, but also at the same time, it's completely heartbreaking because her essential legacy is summarized by the wife of the doorman at her old building, who basically, tells everyone that she's equivalently a prostitute. And they all just say, here's this dead woman. Nobody really called the ambulance or anything because they just said she was dead. And they summarized that she was a prostitute, and that was essentially it. And it was this, A, completely out of nowhere moment, B, sort of funny in the way the dialogue was written, but C, really, really depressing.
Yeah.
And that's when I turned the corner, and I was like, oh, I was not expecting that at all. I thought we were just going to get another 7 pages of metaphysical exploration and it would just fade out. But no, she just ramped it to level 10.
I got to say, some of my favorite, maybe my favorite passage of the book was her life flashing before her eyes as she lay on the pavement.
Can you read some of it?
I guess there's a couple of passages that I want to read because it goes on for a bit, and the whole thing, it's very beautiful. In deep, vivifying nausea, her heart retreating white and solid in a dry fall. And since she was thinking darkly about Vicente, she saw Adriano, Vicente, Miguel, Daniel, in a bright and dizzying race through the streets of the city like a wind through flowing hair. She entered the farm for an instant. She rocked herself quick in the chair, and with absolute amazement, looked at herself white and with dark eyes in a mirror. Long corridors were taking shape inside her, long, tired corridors, difficult and dark, doors closing one after the next without noise, with fright and care, while a moment of Daniel's rage was thought by her, and the instants were brightly following one after the next. She and Daniel chewed the last of the fruit that was running down their chins, and were looking at each other with shining and intelligent eyes, almost one of them enjoying what the other was eating. It was cold, her red and painful nose in the courtyard of the farm. She directed a shiver at Daniel. She who'd never wasted time, confused, deaf, fast, bright, dissonant, the noise that comes from the orchestra tuning itself for the concert, and a movement of well-being seeking comfort, the unaccustomed heart. What was happening was so simple that she didn't know from where to understand. In the frozen twilight, black corridors, narrow, empty and damp, a dormant and numb substance, and suddenly, the white butterfly fluttering in the shadowy corridors, getting lost at the end of the darkness. She was obscurely wanting to cut herself off. And then the can I just keep reading this whole thing?
Do it.
I love this whole passage. The street was steaming, cold and sleepy. Her own heart was being taken by surprise. Her head heavy with stunning grace. While the streets of Upper Marsh were heading fast and flickering inside their smell of apple, sawdust, import and export, that lack of sea. And suddenly ravished by her own spirit. It was an extremely intimate and strange moment. She was recognizing all of this. How often had she rehearsed it without realizing it? And now extraordinarily hushed, purified of her own sources of energy, surrendering even future possibilities. Ah, not to have recognized then that type of gesture, almost a position of thought, the head leaning to one side like that. Not to have paid attention to it then. How frightened she would have been if she'd understood it. But now she wasn't frightened. The urge was inferior to the most secret quality of being. In the frozen twilight, a new exactness being born. No, it wasn't a decaying sensation, but wanting obscurely to cut herself off. The difficulty that was coming from the sky, that was coming. The first real event, the only fact that could serve as a beginning to her life. Free like throwing a crystal glass through a window, the irresistible movement that could no longer hold itself back. She'd also tried to rehearse when she would seek to distinguish the smell in the construction sites, had rehearsed the smell in the half-twilight, whitewash, wood, cold iron, fallen dust, watching. How could she have forgotten? Yes, the field empty of weeds in the wind without her, entirely without her. Without any sensation, just the wind, unreality approaching in iridescent colors, at high, light, penetrating speed, mists fraying and uncovering firm shapes, a mute sound bursting from the divine intimacy of things, silence pressing down on particles of earth in darkness, and black ants, slow and tall, walking atop thick grains of earth, the wind running high, far ahead. A limpid cube dangling in the air, and the light running parallel to every point, was present. Thus it had been, thus it would be. And the wind, she who had been so steady. I love it.
And scene.
Yeah.
So now you get the trophy for longest quote read in any of our episodes.
So here's the thing about this. That passage is incredible, and there are passages like that are incredible, but I don't know if they all belong to be in like one. Because this book is so challenging, it's both rewarding for the person that reads it, but also, how do I phrase this? It seems like if that ending was its own slim novel or short story, I think it would be better. Or if the opening childhood was its own short story or novel, it would be better. It's almost like these parts don't necessarily even need to be together for them to have as strong of an impact. Because her language is so good, it sort of pulls me away from any idea of real narrative or connection to character in a way that it's like poetry.
Yeah, I hear you on that, and I think in practice I agree with you, but I was actually rereading these last couple pages right before we started recording, and then when Nathan reread it, it kind of has cemented a little bit of a theory, which is there's a line in there which says something equivalent of she had been rehearsing without knowing it, right? And I think we're all familiar with the general, who knows that this is really real, right? But like as you're dying, your whole life flashes before your eyes, or it's all compacted into that specific instantaneous moment. And so the concept that her like deep analysis and attempts to get to the nucleus of a single instant is in some way prep for this nucleus of a single instant of her dying. I think from a structural standpoint, that connects it to me. I agree with what you're saying. Like the language is both the best part about this book and also the thing that might even get in the way of itself the most. But I guess through that lens, just from a structural standpoint, like, is that what she's trying to do? She's trying to draw some line of equivalency between those rehearsals of a single moment and then the final single moment. Like I don't have a grand philosophical concept behind that, but at least just from how she lays it out and a structural and a prose standpoint, I think I can get behind that.
It works for me. I mean, there is a difficulty in like an obtuseness. There's no chapters. Paragraphs go on forever. Not to mention the syntax being very peculiar. But it's rewarding in the way like when you befriend somebody who makes no effort to be friends with you, and then you realize like, oh, this person's pretty interesting actually. Versus, the salesperson who's like interesting immediately, but you realize that they're getting something from you. So I think to me, the making an effort to get into it is rewarding in itself. It's it's not pop music. And I don't think that I didn't find it to be obtuse for obtuseness' sake, which I did find with Beckett. I never felt like she was pissing in my face. Like she was trying to communicate something that's so ephemeral. And she does it with earnestness throughout the whole book, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it lands for me and sometimes it doesn't, but that's how I felt about it. And to me, it does. They're not disconnected. They're all very connected in the way that one's life is very connected, even if it's not always clear how.
One would say much like the Tree of Life.
It's funny. The Tree of Life is a lot like it.
It really is. Have either of you read Joseph Heller's Something Happened?
No.
So it really reminds me of that. Again, not from a tone standpoint, because this thing kind of stands alone. But Something Happened is this really long, difficult book, and it hits a lot on kind of the minutia. I think the guy's name is Bob Slocum. He's this sort of shithead businessman type, and it goes through all of his failures and improprieties and all that. But like the one thing that he loves is his young son, and his young son kind of gives him a little bit of like a lens into himself, and it kind of justifies his existence in a way. But I forget the exact thing, but like right at the end of the book, as the title would imply, something happens, and the boy has some sort of accident, and the man loves him so much that he's basically cradling him and hugging him like while help is coming. And the boy dies, and they later determine that he didn't die from the accident. He died from suffocation of the father loving him too much. But the point being is that the whole book is this really difficult, like Nathan said, like you got to work for the friendship of this book, right? It's not being delivered to you. But because it has that like intensely impactful ending, much like the Chandelier, you look back on the book that maybe in the moment you were struggling a bit or you're kind of, on the fence. But to me, it just slingshots this thing right at the end. And I kind of arrive at the end of this book in the same way at the end of Heller's Something Happened, where I can't really think of that many other books that really kind of like lull you in this sort of extended, drawn out, expedition of sorts. And then right at the end, it pulls you into this thing that kind of, gives purpose to all of the work that you put in before. And so, I'm always thinking about different structures and what people's approaches are for how they deliver a narrative. So I kind of dig it just for that. Like I hear what you're saying, David, that, it could truly be more impactful in a way if it was in short story form.
Maybe. I don't
kind of.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think all of the effort to wade through the ontological and metaphysical poetics somehow, and maybe just because it is so fresh in my mind that like I feel like I'm still kind of like wading through it. But there is something about the ending that is, Nick, you kind of hit on it, which is a little cheesy to say, but like somehow the death is what gives it greater meaning. It's almost like this. I lost my train of thought. Sorry, because I'm reading passages and trying to speak at the same time.
It's impossible.
It's impossible. It's like I just got lost in this quote. There's a section somewhere in the middle, and you'll probably remember it because it has a lot of parentheticals, and it's where she's talking about like her things.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
I just got stuck trying to read that and rationalize why I didn't want to like the book but ended up really liking it. With the passing of time, a secret watchful life had been born in her. She would communicate silently with the objects around her in a certain tenacious and unnoticed mania that nonetheless was being her most interior and truthful way of existing. Before carrying out any act, she would know that something would go against it or that a light wave would allow it. She had so much desire to live that she had become superstitious. She had entered her own reign. The rooms that smelled like tunnels, the things lightly dislocated from themselves as if they had just been alive. Superstition was the most delicate thing she had known. Through the slipping of a second, she could surpass that warm and mysteriously vehement affirmation that the thing, understand, is there, right there, and therefore is like that. Objects, that small picture, for example, knows itself profoundly, and even that half-open window, the little table perched on the points of 3 legs beneath the roof, understand, know itself profoundly. And then there's also whatever isn't present, and which helps, and everything moves forward, even that power, an instant that follows itself from it is born, the yes and the no. But if you linger a bit longer, you end up knowing that the instant is an instant, and then it is mutely shredded. You have to start over, winding, rewinding, winding powers, without letting certain things of the world get too close. Above all, what's past is past, and is exactly just of that small instant we're talking about. And also that one, and also that one, and also that one, but every one for itself, and before you know it, without a single word, she's already achieved. Anyway, her whole being was propped up by a few words, but used with such meaning, with such a kind of blind and strange nature that, when she used them out loud or in thought, or when she heard them, she didn't tremble, didn't recognize, didn't realize. In her busy and detailed intimacy, she was living without memory. Before falling asleep, concentrated and magical, she would say farewell to things in a last instant of lightly illuminated consciousness. And it just kind of, it literally goes on for like 2 pages. I highlighted like this large section, but I still am having a hard time figuring out what it is other than just this. Like Nathan, you talk about what it is she's trying to capture. What is it?
I think that's the whole problem. It's like Zeno's paradox of truth. Like trying to get to the truth, taking more and more steps toward it. Mathematically, you get closer, but you can't ever reach it. And that's it. It's just never, you can't wrap your head, like we don't have words for what it really is. As much as we get into it, it just like can't really exist.
Did Lispector, do either of y'all know, did she have like epilepsy or anything?
I have
no idea.
Because I mean, her
I literally
character,
know nothing. I came into this cold, man.
Yeah, I don't know anything either. But so the character Virginia has fainting fits, and in her fainting fits, both as a child, and I don't think she actually does in the book have one as an adult, but she describes being afraid of having one. But as a child, these fainting fits seem to give her sort of mystical insights, and the language and the way she writes about things, it's very mystical.
Yeah.
Trying to describe what is.
It's like the fictional renderings of Heidegger's Being and Time.
Really?
Well, that was kind of what I was thinking when I mentioned ontological and the whole idea of what is being, like what is isness. And it's so hard to figure out what this book is trying to hold on to, because this book is just trying to grasp at what being is.
She was like 23, 24 when she wrote this book.
Well,
yeah.
You don't have to make me feel bad about my life.
I mean, I wonder, to me, the only thing that comes close to this kind of way of looking at things is a lot of psychedelic drugs.
Yeah.
And this sort of clarity, and you take issue with me using the word clarity, but to me, there's a clarity of like seeing through the glass, but you only can describe what you see through the glass by what's on the glass. But you are looking at some point in the distance through the glass. And so you try to arrange, these pieces on the glass to cohere with the image that you see beyond it, but you can't quite.
Would you say that the glass is comprised or makes up a chandelier?
Well, I mean, we could talk about what the symbolism of the chandelier is. Maybe. I mean, I think the chandelier to me is like it's like a prism of prisms, and so yeah, maybe it is. Maybe that's the insight. Is like if you could hold the image of the chandelier in your head, you would know everything. You would know what it is, but you can't. You can't actually hold the whole chandelier in your head.
She'd look at it immobile, uneasy, seeming to foresee a terrible life, that icy existence, once in a flash. The chandelier would scatter in chrysanthemums and joy. Another time, while she was running through the parlor, it was a chaste seed. The chandelier, she'd skip off without looking back. So sorry if I interrupted your psychedelic speech, but you're hitting like the glass aspect, and I think that's the symbolism of the chandelier. Like you said, it's the prism effect, right? It's all angles. It's momentary. Like it's the physical rendering of that feeling.
So imagine, and to me, it's like if you had a moment of insight where you could hold the whole chandelier in your mind, all the refracted light, and then try to recreate that with a flashlight. Try to recreate that without having the chandelier. That's kind of what the book is attempting to do, in my opinion. Like the chandelier takes light and casts light in every direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you think of how many different individual components there are in a chandelier and how they're all sort of spinning and behaving on their own, axes, whatever, and you think of each of them as a prism, and you think of the whole as being a combination of these prisms, and you think of, the flashlight as having its own variable, right? The angle, the brightness, all that stuff. Mm. And when you send this light into a cascading prism upon prism upon prism, and the light just refracts out, that moment that's created can only exist with those exact physical parameters, because one tiny tweak will totally change, that prism effect, that behavior of the chandelier. And so if you completely grasp that, can you ever recreate that again? I think that's what Nathan's getting at.
So this novel is a beam of light shifting through the various incandescent reflections and refractions inside a chandelier?
I'm trying to get at something slightly different than that. It's like, imagine a higher intelligence that it's hard to imagine a higher intelligence, right? Using your mind, because you don't have those tools. But I think if you think about light as a metaphor for that, how can I say this? It's like, imagine seeing from the front of your head and from the back of your head at the same time. And imagine being able to hold that image in your head, what's before you and what's behind you. You can't do it. You can only see in one direction. Some other brain, some other animal can do that. Now imagine a chandelier. The light is passing in every direction and passing through, you could pass through one prism into another prism and out again. And imagine seeing that. Imagine seeing all of those angles simultaneously and being able to hold that image in your head simultaneously. That's the power of the imagery to me. I don't know if that's making any sense at all. No?
Sorry, I'm just laughing at our chandelier digression, which, for the record, fits perfectly with the tone of this book. So it's positive, not a negative.
Yeah.
I don't know. Where are we at with this thing? How long have we been talking? Honestly, like, the more abstract these books are and potentially grading, like, they're just far more fun to talk about.
Yeah.
We're trying to talk about Steinbeck, however many episodes ago. We got 30 minutes in. We're like, this is fucking boring.
I've been dying to talk about this book.
Tells you what's going on.
Because it's not something that's really relatable unless you've read the book.
And I have to say, I honestly, like, outside of maybe, I think I mentioned it, like Portrait of the Artist and maybe the Molly section at the end of Ulysses, like this, I can't think of anything that I've read that reads like this at all.
Yeah, same.
It really is so unique. Damn.
Nick, I wanted to ask, because this is one of her less popular pieces, right? And since you've read some of her other works, what is she known for?
I think some of her shorts. So there's a popular one that comes up, The Imitation of the Rose. That, I feel like that's your entry point into Lispector. It's a similar thing. It's a woman who had a mental breakdown, and she comes back into real life, and she basically has these just deep metaphysical insights while looking at a bouquet of roses, right? And it kind of shows, I don't know, the how ephemeral, mental stability is, or how we define it, like all those things. And I feel like that vibe that she has in that short story, to me, is echoed in this book. It's echoed in Near to the Wild Heart. It's echoed in, is it The Passion According to G.H.? I think that's the title. And so you hear these things about Lispector in Brazil, about how she's kind of iconic and all this. And I think it's just because she, wrote in such a unique style that is completely unparalleled. But I think that this importance of what, a thing is, mixed with this view into social commentary and very much a feminist analysis of what it was like in mid-century kind of middle-class life. I think that's her bag, right? That's what you get from a lot of these books. And they don't differ that much. Certainly the metaphysical crises are a little bit different. In Passion According to G.H., it's a woman in a room who basically slams a cockroach in a door and then eventually puts some of it in her mouth. That's like the whole book. But it has these pages and pages of, what is anything, right? And like the ending of that is supposed to be sort of famous within, Latin American literature, which makes sense. But I just can't imagine a world. It's hard for me to see this as being, any level of iconic or popular, because it's just so fundamentally difficult. But at the same time, I remember that, we hold up Joyce, we hold up Beckett, and if you really crack open Ulysses, are a lot of people really still reading Ulysses? It's fucking hard.
Yeah.
So I think it's that. I think it has some notoriety, but I think she was doing a lot of really useful work in giving, women of that period a voice. And she was doing it in this way that in no way compromised, artistic vision and things like that. And I'm just drawn to people who do stuff that is against the grain. And, this fundamentally represents that to me. And so as much as I've kind of struggled reading a bunch of these, and even not even sure if I liked some of them at points, I will always be down for somebody who's like pushing the envelope.
Yeah. And I think pushing it in a way that doesn't remove it from any sort of human connection, which I think is kind of what Nathan was getting at with his complaints against Beckett, which I disagree with wholeheartedly, although except maybe for Watt. I was thinking about it because I'm trying to read like other experimental writing. It feels very divorced from any sort of feeling. This is the opposite. This is like experimental to get at what it means to feel anything or to know anything or to think anything. Mm-hmm. It's so human. It's just such a beautiful and intense experience.
Thanks for listening. As always, you can find us at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Twitter and Instagram with the handle booksosubstance. Yeah, you're right. I mean, maybe my viewpoint is fundamentally limited by my drugs of choice of coffee and white wine.